chapter 34, talking about the coelomated invertebrates. Now we've moved on to groups of organisms that have true body cavity, the coelom, and we're splitting them into two different lineages, the coelomated invertebrates and the coelomated vertebrates. So chapter 35 will be about the coelomated vertebrates. Now, in many ways, this mirrors the separation between the protostomes and deuterostomes with one exception. There's one organism that is a coelomated invertebrate, but it is still a deuterostome. Anyone know what that is? One group? What?
Jellyfish?
Not jellyfish. We've already talked about jellyfish. They're gone. Nope. Nope.
Insects?
Nope. These are all protostomes. What's a deuterostome? It doesn't have a backbone. We have a backbone. See, kinder. The sea stars, the kinder, sea urchins, those things. Okay? Those are actually more closely related to us than any of the protostomes. They're deuterostomes, but they don't have a backbone. So they're grouped in chapter 34, but you remember they are still considered deuterostomes. Now, a quick note, exam 2 is available as of this morning. It's due on March 20th, so that's this Wednesday at 11:59 p.m. On the Blackboard site, it's listed as March 27th. If you look at the due date underneath, but this is incorrect, so you do have to finish it by Wednesday. Any questions about exam number 2? All right. Now, the next homework will be assigned sometime this week. I'll put that up, those LearnSmart modules. Chapter 34 is already available. The due date was changed so it matches when we're going to be covering it with the exam. So if you haven't already started on chapter 34, you can do that. The other chapters that are for the next exam should be available sometime soon. When we finished on Friday, way back before spring break, so I don't know if you guys can remember that far back, we were talking about the mollusk body plan. So we were talking about sort of similar characteristics that we see in all of the mollusks. And one of these was the mantle. This idea that there's this epidermal sheet that sort of covers the mollusk itself. It bounds what we refer to as the mantle cavity. So there's an interior structure inside this mantle where many of the visceral organs are found. The mantle is also responsible for secreting shells. Some mollusks have shells, some do not. All mollusks also have a foot. Now, it's not like the foot you have. Basically, it's just a strong, muscular structure that's used for locomotion. Depending on the kind of mollusk, sometimes it's a singular structure, sometimes it's broken down into multiple arms and tentacles. But those are the same, overall that's the same structure that's referred to as the foot. Now mollusks, we start to see organisms that have a very distinct internal organs. We did see some acoelomates and some pseudocoelomates with internal structures, things like the platyhelminthes. But now that we have a true body cavity, we start to see the evolution of much more diverse structural systems, organ systems within the organism. Now, one thing that's sort of interesting about mollusks is even though they have a true body cavity, it is vastly reduced. Basically, the body cavity is limited to a few open small spaces around some of these organs, some of these excretory organs, the heart, parts of the intestine. So the organism as a whole, the mollusk as a whole, does not have the same huge body cavity that we see in something like mammals or ourselves. In terms of the kinds of organ systems that we see in mollusks, we have digestive systems. That's pretty common. Most of the things we've been talking about so far have digestive systems. We have excretory systems for removing waste from the body. We started to see that as well. We have reproductive organs that we've seen as well with others. But we also start to see more advanced additional organ systems, especially things like nervous systems. All of these are concentrated in the visceral mass, in the body of the mollusk itself, not inside the body cavity. Now, one of the things the mollusks need to do is, many of these live in aquatic environments. They need to have a way of extracting oxygen from the water. So they have gill-like structures that are referred to as cnidia. These are, in aquatic mollusks, these are the gills. These are how they get oxygen from the water. But in bivalves, they're also used for filtering inga. As water is moving through the mollusk, water needs to move because that's how they get their oxygen. It's passed through. But the bivalves, things like the oysters, mussels, clams, they're also going to be filtering material out of the water that they use as a food source. Why is this important for human activities? What does this mean about the bivalves?
Don't we consume mollusks?
We do consume mollusks. They're yummy. Do we consume bivalves? Who doesn't like a raw oyster on the hatch?
Oh,
Right? Scallops. Those are bivalves, right? So if they're filtering this material out, what does that mean about our consumption?
good.
Bad.
One of you's got to be right. Neutral, maybe a little. Well, it turns out that because of this filter feeding behavior, mollusks that live in polluted environments act as bioaccumulators. They build up hazardous material, pollution, waste inside their system. And if we eat those mollusks, then we are getting a large dose of sometimes some very dangerous chemicals, some very dangerous pollutants. This is why you have to be very careful. If you are someone who likes bivalves, you have to be very careful about where they come from. If they come from polluted waters, there's a very good chance they have accumulated a lot of these pollutants, and they could actually be not necessarily lethally toxic, but toxic to humans. So this filtering behavior is very important in terms of sort of what role they play in terms of cleaning up the environment, but then also accumulating material within their tissues. Now, mollusks also have what's called a radula. This is a mouth structure. The vast majority of mollusks have these. The mouth structure, this radula, is basically, you can think of it as sort of the same idea as mollusk teeth. It's a tongue-like structure that has small protrusions that is used to sort of scrape material, remove material when they're feeding. So for mollusks that feed on algae, they actually sort of run their radula along the surface, and it scrapes the algae up, enabling them to feed on it. In mollusks that are predatory, what are some predatory mollusks?
Octopus?
An octopus is a predatory mollusk. There are some snails that are predatory. In predatory snails, the radula has actually been modified into a drill-like structure. It's still the same thing. It's sort of this rasp-like tongue, but it's been modified to drill into clamshells, because once there's a hole in the clamshell, the clam can't hold tightly closed anymore. It then opens, and the snail is able to eat the mollusk, eat the clam. Now, there are some species that have lost the radula. They no longer use that for feeding. We mentioned the bivalves. These have gills, so they don't have any need for this sort of scraping kind of mechanism, so they've lost the radula. What common trait that you'll see in biological organisms, if there's something that is no longer needed and it costs biological energy, if it costs metabolic energy to produce, there's going to be evolutionary pressure not to produce it. There's going to be an evolutionary trend so that if you don't have to use the energy to produce an organ or a structure that's no longer needed, you're going to be at a favorable advantage compared to those who do. Now, in some they've actually lost the radula. We mentioned the octopus as a predatory mollusk. The beak that they have is not the radula. It's actually a different structure, so they've lost the radula as well. So this is sort of what the radula looks like on a chitin. So this is a side view of a chitin. We have the mouth structure right here. Inside the mouth is this tongue structure. This is what the radula looks like. So you can see how it can be very good at scraping things off of algae, scraping things off of rocks, and so forth. Many snails, many slugs, chitins, these are all going to be the organisms that have these radula. And then lastly, when we think about mollusks, we oftentimes think about a shell. The shell is there as a protective measure, but it protects against two different things. One thing might be the first thing you think about. It protects against predators. If you have something hard surrounding you, especially if you're a nice, soft, squishy mollusk that might be very yummy for a lot of different things, it's going to be very beneficial to have some sort of protection. Have a shell that protects you from predators. But it also protects mollusks from adverse environments, adverse conditions, when it gets dry, when it gets hot. How many people have ever seen a snail shell that looks like it has some sort of film or something covering the opening? That's a mollusk inside, and what it's doing is it's using this snail shell, or it's using this shell to protect itself from very dry, from very hot conditions. It seals up the front of it, and then it retreats inside to wait until it rains or gets a little bit more humid. And so it's protecting it not from predators, but from adverse environments. Now, the shell itself is always going to be secreted by the surface of the mantle. So regardless of the mollusk that we're talking about, if it has a shell, it's secreted by this outer surface of the mantle. Now, the shell is not an essential portion of the mollusk. It's been lost many times. In many mollusks, you'll see a reduced shell, a shell that basically serves no purpose, and so it's not being produced anymore. What's a common mollusk that lives in a terrestrial environment that we can think of that has lost the shell? Slugs. If you think of a slug, you're basically thinking of a snail without a shell. There are differences, but if you're just looking at them, that's sort of what they look like. They are a mollusk. They don't have the shell. They're still perfectly able to survive. They've evolved other mechanisms for dealing with predators. They've evolved other mechanisms for dealing with adverse environments. Now, mollusk shells overall have sort of the similar structure. There's usually 2 layers of calcium carbonate. And so if you sort of look at a shell at a side view, you'll sort of see 2 separate layers. Different mollusks have different kinds of shell structures. We have chitons that have sort of a shell that covers the organism. We have snails, gastropods that have a shell that covers that is sort of usually spiral in shape that can cover the organism. But other than that, the mollusk body plan is going to be very similar. You're going to see a foot in the mollusk. You're going to see a radula in most of the mollusks. You're going to see the mantle cavity. You're going to see the same kinds of internal organ structures. So the mollusk body plan is going to be the same. It's just going to be modified based on the kind of mollusk. So these are 2 different groups of mollusks. You have bivalves, things like the clams and oysters. You see the foot, you see the gill, you see the mantle cavity. Same body plan, different organization. We have some mollusks that are very different, the cephalopods. But if you look at them at an anatomical level, you're still going to see the same kinds of structures. You see the muscular foot, you see the gill structure, you see the mantle cavity. So overall, when you think about mollusks, you need to think about these similarities that they have in terms of their body plan. Now, one thing the mollusks do is we start to see a more advanced excretory system, a method for the mollusks to remove waste from their body. One of these kinds of waste is nitrogenous waste. These are a byproduct of a lot of metabolic activities. And so what we see in mollusks is the evolution of what are referred to as nephridia, which are as organ structure that are used to remove these nitrogenous wastes. These nephridia consist of openings that are lined with cilia, and these cilia are referred to as nephrostomes. And so these openings are found throughout the mollusk, and they're used to excrete this nitrogenous waste. Mollusks also have a circulatory system. So we're starting to deal with organisms that have some sort of circulation or some sort of flow of body fluid. Now, a difference between mollusks and your cells is that the mollusks have what's called an open circulatory system. They still have a heart structure, but they don't have the vessels that are found throughout the entire organism. Instead, they have what's referred to as a hemolymph that is found inside the hemocoel. It just moves around. It still moves, there's still circulation, but it's not as controlled as we see with a closed circulatory system. Our circulatory system is entirely closed. When blood leaves the heart, there's only one direction it can go. It's not just going to start flowing anyway through the body. There are some advantages to the open circulatory system. We'll talk about those when we talk about the circulatory systems themselves. The heart that the mollusks have is a 3-chambered heart. So even though it's not a closed circulatory system, it doesn't mean they don't have a heart. They still can. They have a 3-chambered heart, so they're still pumping this fluid around their system, around their tissues. The difference is once the fluid leaves the heart, it then enters into the hemocoel, and it's much more random in terms of the movement. Now, cephalopods have evolved a closed circulatory system. Cephalopods are probably considered the most advanced of the mollusks. Which ones are the cephalopods? Octopi, squid, and those organisms. They're considered the most advanced. They have a lot of evolutionary adaptations that we sort of consider as advanced adaptations. A closed circulatory system is one of those. Now, in terms of reproduction, most mollusks are gonophoric. This means there's a specific male and a specific female. Gonophoric simply means a separation of the sexes. There are a few species that are hermaphroditic with both male and female reproductive organs. Most of these are snails. So there are some snails that are able to both reproduce, both lay eggs, both produce offspring. Those are the hermaphroditic ones. The vast majority of mollusks, there's going to be a male and there's going to be a female. Doesn't mean they're stuck that way, though. There are some examples of some bivalves, specifically some oysters, where they can change sex based on environmental influence. And so you could start off as one sex. If there's too many of that one sex, they'll then switch to a different sex to equalize the sex ratio. Most mollusks engage in external fertilization. What does this mean?
Fertilize outside the body?
Yes. External fertilization. It's a release of gametes, so the fertilization occurs outside of the body. The males release the sperm, the females release the eggs, and fertilization takes place outside the body. Most mollusks are aquatic in nature, either marine or freshwater, and so the gametes are simply released into the water. Gastropods are one of the few mollusks where there are a lot of terrestrial organisms. And so gastropods are one of the few mollusks that engage in internal fertilization. If you release gametes into the water, what's going to happen? They're going to float around, they're going to disperse, and randomly they might come into contact with each other. So fertilization is going to take place. What happens if you release your gametes in a terrestrial environment? Are they going to move around at all?
No.
They're going to float around? If the female releases her gametes over here and the male releases his gametes over there, what's going to happen? What's the probability that these two are going to randomly come in contact with each other? Not very good. So in terrestrial organisms, internal fertilization is a way to ensure reproductive success. So when we see these terrestrial mollusks, they have evolved internal fertilization. Now, the mollusk zygote undergoes spiral cleavage. Does this mean it's a protostome or a deuterostome? I know, a long time ago. One person saying protostome? Protostome? They're a protostome. Protostomes undergo spiral cleavage. So there are four major classes of mollusks, four major lineages that we're thinking about. One of these are the chitons, the polyplatyphora. So we'll talk about what separates those. One of these are the gastropoda. These are the snails, the slugs, the limpets. One of these are the bivalvia. These include the clams, oysters, and scallops. And then the last ones are the cephalopoda. These are the squids, the octopi, the cuttlefish, and the nautilus. So most mollusks fit into one of these classes. There are a few random others that do not, but we're not going to worry about this. This is an overview of the primary classes. So what are these chitons? Well, these chitons are marine mollusks. They have this oval-shaped body. This is what a chiton looks like from the top down. What do you notice about them? They look like a rock. They have a shell. Yeah, that's true. They have 8 overlapping calcareous plates. So they have this calcium carbonate shell secreted by the mantle. I know it's Monday after spring break. Got to get going. So they have these calcium plates that are secreted by the mantle, and the chiton is recognized by having these 8 overlapping plates. So it's not a single shell structure like we see in a snail, like we see in a bivalve. It's 8 plates that overlap with each other. Underneath the plates, the body itself is not segmented. Thinking about the mollusk body plan, did we see segmentation in the body plan? Not really. We saw different structures, different organ structures, but the body itself was sort of a continuous whole. So mollusks are not one of the organisms that we see segmentation occurring in. But if you look at this, you might think they are segmented. Look, I can count the segments. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. But what you have to think about is that is the shell. Underneath that, they don't show any sort of segmentation. Now, most chitons are grazing herbivores. They're going to be sort of moving along in a marine environment. grazing on any algae, grazing on any plant structures that might be growing on these rocks. So what do they have to be grazing with?
Oh, the little thing with
Starts with an R.
the
Begins with an R. Radula.
Yeah.
That scraping tongue. So as they're moving along, they're scraping that tongue along the rocks and then injecting any food particles that come off. The next class is the class Gastropoda. These include the snails, the slugs, nudibranchs, and limpets. Primarily, the gastropods are a marine group. The vast majority of gastropods live in marine, saltwater environments. There are some freshwater examples as well. But gastropods are also one of the few lineages of mollusks that has made the transition to a terrestrial environment. Every single terrestrial mollusk is going to be a gastropod. So if in a test, I tell you, I find this an organism that has a foot structure, and it has a radula, and it has a mantle, and it secretes a shell from the mantle, and it was found in the grass. What are you going to tell me? What kind of class is it? It's going to be a gastropod. The characteristics would tell you it's a mollusk. The specific detail that I found it in a terrestrial environment is going to tell you that it's a gastropod, since that's the only terrestrial mollusk. Most gastropods have a single shell structure. The chitons that we talked about, you can actually think of them as having 8 overlapping shells. Bivalves have 2 shells that are hinged together. The gastropods sort of have this single cell structure. The slugs are an example of a gastropod that has lost the shell. But they're still perfectly adapted. They're still perfectly able to survive. Now, you might think they might be in a detriment in certain kinds of environments. If the shell protects you against adverse conditions, you think that the slug might not be able to survive in very dry, very hot conditions like we have around here. But we certainly do have slugs around here, so they have adapted to survive. And in fact, there's one species of slug that a colleague in the biology department, Dr. Fred Zayden, was studying, the small black slug. I forget the species name, but it's one that is he finds very active in the middle of the day. In fact, he finds them all the time sort of moving across the roads in the bright, drying sun. And as a physiological ecologist, he's very curious about this. How are they adapted to survive? Here you have this slug. They're usually sort of soft, squishy, wet organisms, black, which absorbs heat, and yet it's moving around in the bright sun and the dry heat here in South Texas. How is it able to survive? How does it not just shrivel up into a dry husk of nothing? So he started doing some research on these, basically torturing slugs by putting them in at different temperatures, seeing how long they survived, and what he found was they actually have a very high temperature tolerance. Now, the head of the gastropod is relatively unique. They actually have evolved eye structures. The eyes are usually found at the ends of tentacles. If you sort of think about a snail, think about way back when you were a little kid, you draw the snail with a shell, draw 2 little tentacles with eyeballs right on top, sort of like they show in SpongeBob SquarePants. That's what they have. They have these eyes that are on the tops of the tentacles. They also undergo a process that's called torsion. So the body itself twists as the organism develops. This is unique among animals. No other animal undergoes this same sort of twisting developmental process. So we're not talking about something like spiral cleavage. We're not talking about the shell growing in a radial pattern, but instead we're actually talking about a twisting of the body itself. The internal structures actually twist around as well. So the mantle cavity and the anus are actually moved from the posterior end of the organism to the front end. So you sort of think about trying to twist like that yourself. They do this all the time. So these are the gastropods. Torsion is not the same thing as the spiraling or the coiling behavior that we see in the shells. The torsion is something that goes on internally, structurally, as a twisting process. The coiling that we see is something that we see like in the spiral winding of the shells. And you see the 2 eye stalks right there. Now, nudibranchs are another example of a gastropod. These are aquatic gastropods. These are very active hunters. These actually hunt nidarians. What are nidarians? Jellyfish. So they're going around, they're hunting cnidarians. Some nudibranchs actually extract the nematocysts, remember the stinging apparatus in the tentacles, from the cnidarians that they eat, and they transfer them to their body surface. They're stealing the weapon from their enemy and using it themselves. And this then protects them. So many nudibranchs have then actually lost the shell as well. They don't need to worry about it protecting from the environment because they're aquatic. They don't need to worry about water loss. They still need to worry about predators, but they found another way to deal with predators. Nudibranchs also have exposed gills. So again, mollusks have, especially aquatic mollusks, have these gill structures. In the nudibranchs, they're exposed on the external portion of the body. The next class of mollusks are the bivalves. These include the clams, the scallops, mussels, oysters, and all the yummy ones. Who likes bivalves here? No? Maybe I'll make everyone eat one for the next big dance. We'll see. Most of the bivalves are marine in nature. Some of them are freshwater. So the vast majority live in marine environments. They don't have a radula. All bivalves have lost the radula because they engage in this filter feeding for getting their food. They also don't move as much. They do have a muscular foot. What do they use that foot for? Moving, yes. How do they move? Do you see a clam or a oyster moving along the ground? What do? There's two things they do. If you were to scare one, what's the first thing it's going to do? Close up. So they have a contractor muscle that is used to close the shell. That still is not the foot, however. The foot is used primarily to dig the organism into the ground. So they don't have directional movement. They've thus lost the need for a head region. You need a head if you want to be moving forward. If you never move forward in your life, you don't need a head anymore. Now, the reason they're called bivalves is because they have two shells that are valved. The shells are hinged together so they can open and close on this hinge. They use adductor muscles, as I said, not the foot, to sort of control this movement of the shell. This is a very strong muscle. If anyone's ever tried to open a clam or an oyster that's closed, it's very difficult to do. They also have a specific structure to engage in this filter feeding behavior. Remember, they're not moving around. The gills are inside the organism, so they need to bring water to them both for food and for breathing. So water enters into the bivalve through what's referred to as the inhalant siphon. Inhalant, breathing in, siphon, a tube. So it's a tube for bringing this water in. It then flows through the mantle across the gills, which are used to extract oxygen and food, and then it exits the bivalve through the exhalant siphon. Exhale, breathe out. So bringing water in through the inhalant siphon, running it across, and then pushing it out through the exhalant siphon. And because of this, they are filter feeders. They're filtering the water as it moves through their system, removing any particulate organic matter that they can use as a food source. So if we look at the bivalves, again, we still see highly developed systems. We have a heart, we have a kidney, we have a stomach, we have an intestine, we have reproductive organs. So we do have a highly developed organ systems within the organism itself. We still have this muscular foot. That's going to be used, or that's going to be the common characteristic that we see in mollusks. But then we have the inhalant siphon where water gets filtered in. It runs through the mantle cavity across the gills. The mouth is then at this other end, so food particles are brushed down into this mouth region. The water then flows back through and is pushed out through the exhalant siphon. So that's how they breathe, that's how they eat. The last class of mollusks are the cephalopods. There are more than 600 different species. These are completely, exclusively marine in nature. There are no freshwater cephalopods. There are no terrestrial cephalopods. The reason why I sometimes accidentally refer to them as cephalopods with a TH instead of a PH, because when I was a student, I had a roommate named Seth. He was a biology major. We both took marine biology together. And when the teacher would talk, he would always refer to these as cephalopods because he was sort of making fun of my roommate a little bit. Good-naturedly, but he would always do that. So I always call them cephalopods as well. They are active predators. So these are active hunters. They're going to be going around looking for prey items. Prey items are not limited to small things. What's this, if anyone's been following the news, what's something they've just recently found a picture of, developed a picture of?
Giant squid.
Giant squid. The first picture of a living giant squid. They've been washed up on the shore before, but we've never had a picture of one alive. They're huge, meters long, and they are hunting some huge prey. What are they hunting?
Whales.
Whales, sperm whales. You can't get much larger prey than that. Now, as I mentioned, the cephalopods are the only mollusks that have a closed circulatory system. Other mollusks have the heart, but then the heart beats the fluid into the hemolymph, so they have this open circulatory system. The cephalopods have a closed circulatory system. They actually have vessel structures that are used for moving the fluid around. And the foot has also evolved significantly in the cephalopods. Instead of just having a single muscular foot that's used for simple motion, the foot has evolved into a series of tentacles that are equipped with suction cups. And these tentacles are not usually used in motion. They can assist, they can help the swimming process, but they're actually used as sensory organs that they can feel with these tentacles. Cephalopods are very curious animals, and they can feel with the tentacles. So when you see an octopus sort of moving around with the tentacles, what it's doing is it's getting information about the environment. They have a beak-like jaw that is different than the radula. It's not an evolved radula. It's a different structure entirely. And some of these actually produce a toxic saliva. There are some octopi that are dangerous that can kill a human because of this toxic saliva. Now, in terms of all invertebrates, not just mollusks, but all invertebrates together, the cephalopods have the largest relative brain size. So it's thought that they are among the most intelligent of all invertebrates. The level of intelligence has been debated, but there is no doubt that they are capable of solving problems. There's no doubt that they're capable of using tools. Researchers have done things where they've put a piece of food, a bivalve or something like that, inside a glass jar with a screw lid. I have a hard enough time opening up those lids. They put those into a tank. An octopus comes along, sort of picks it up, is feeling around, is looking at what's inside, figures out how to unscrew the lid, then get the food inside. That's pretty intelligent for something that doesn't have any bones. What? They'll use rocks. They use rocks to sort of camouflage themselves. They use rocks to break things for food items. I read about a scientist who was studying cephalopods in his lab. He had octopi tanks all over the place trying to study their intelligence. And one day he came back in the lab and he saw all these things knocked over and he said, oh, the janitors must have been here and sort of been playing with the cephalopods. He yelled at the janitors. He said, look, leave my stuff alone, please. Came back, things were knocked all over on the bench again. The janitor said, we weren't doing anything. He said, okay, I'm going to get to the bottom of this. He set up a video camera to see that maybe one of my students is sneaking in. What do you think the video camera showed? The octopus. The octopus was crawling out of the tank, basically holding its breath, and would be exploring around, seeing. They would show them picking things up with the tentacles, feeling what was around it, and then it would crawl back into the tank. It was curious. It wanted to see what was around it. I mean, think about that. That's the same thing as you going into the water, holding your breath, swimming down to the bottom, sort of looking through the sand, seeing if you find a shell or something like that. So there's no doubt that octopi are very intelligent. There's current research being done on exactly what they're capable of learning, exactly the level of tool manipulation they're able to engage in. Obviously, if they're intelligent, they have an extremely highly developed nervous system. The tentacles that have these suction cups are very sensitive. They can pick up minute differences in what they're holding in terms of the physical structure. So they have very sensitive nerve receptors in these tentacles. The tentacle movement is very fine, very controlled. They are able to control exactly what's happening with these tentacles. You'll find that's something that is very critical for advanced evolutionary organisms. You have to have fine, controlled motor movement. You have to be able to control exactly what you're doing. Now, as we said, most living cephalopods lack an external shell. One exception to this is the chambered nautilus. It looks sort of like a snail that floats in the water, but it is a cephalopod. It has a shell structure. There are some cephalopods that have an internal shell. Squid and cuttlefish have an internal cartilaginous shell structure. If you ever have a squid that you're eating, you have to know if you're preparing it, you need to remove that internal shell. But they don't have any sort of external shell. And as I mentioned, they don't use the feet for locomotion very much. Yes, you can see an octopus sort of moving on the ground, walking along. But what they've actually evolved is their siphon has evolved into a structure that can engage in jet propulsion. This is what they use to escape from predators. They can exhale water so quickly from the siphon, it basically is the same thing as a jet engine, and it moves them away very quickly. If you've ever seen a video of an octopus or a squid that sort of then suddenly seemingly disappears, that's how quick the jet propulsion system works. They also can inject an ink from this siphon, and they'll oftentimes do this at the same time that they move away. It's thought that this is for confusing the predator. So the predator sees the cephalopod there, then all of a sudden it sees this mass, but it thinks that's still the cephalopod, but in reality, the cephalopod is long gone. And there are many cephalopods that are capable in changing their color. They have chromatophore cells that are capable of changing the external color into just about any kind of color that you can think of. They use this for camouflage. And the camouflage is so fine. They've done things where they put an octopus on a checkered black and white background, and the octopus then matches that checkered pattern. Not just in terms of becoming black and white, but the actual edges and lines. So you might have one tentacle that will be part black and then have part white, depending on where it's found on the background. But they also use these colors for communication. Depending on what kind of mood they're in, if they're aggressive, if they're feeling threatened, they'll display different colors. Obviously, they need to have a very developed visual sense in order to see the colors, and the cephalopod eyes are among the best eyes that we see out there in terms of visual acuity. So now we move on to a new phylum, away from the mollusks, talking now about the annelids. These, again, are coelomated invertebrates. These are the segmented worms. This includes the lineage of earthworms. So if you're trying to sort of wrap your head around what annelids are, just think about the earthworm. With these annelids, the body, we now see extreme examples of body segmentation. The body itself is built upon repeated units. So where the mollusk, we have a single unsegmented body, a single body structure. We now, in the annelids, start to see a severe body segmentation where within any individual unit, we're going to see the same kinds of structures. This body segmentation allows for specialization. You can start to have certain body units that are engaged in things like reproduction, engaged in circulation, engaged in feeding. So you can start to specialize different parts of the organism. They used to be thought to be closely related to insects because of this segmentation. Insects and arthropods are another phylum that show very clear body segmentation. And so they said, oh, we see body segmentation here, we see body segmentation here. That must mean that they're similar. But molecular evidence has shown that both of these groups of organisms have evolved segmentation independently of each other. Now, the annelids themselves may not be a monophyletic group. There may be multiple lineages of animals that we call the annelids that sort of evolved independently of each other. In terms of a body plan, we start to see a well-developed head region. Now, when I say well-developed, I don't necessarily mean externally. If you look at an earthworm, can you see which is the head and which is the tail? Probably pretty difficult. When we say well-developed, we're talking about internal structure. The head region has a well-developed cerebral ganglion, so there's a nerve structure that's located near the head. There are sensory organs that are found in each segment, and they are arranged in a ring-like structure within the segments. Many species of annelids have eyes, not all of them. The segments are, if you look internally, the segments are divided by septa, so you don't just have sort of an external appearance of segments, there's actually internal divisions of the body into these different segments. So each segment is going to have a pair of excretory organs to excrete waste. Each segment is going to have at least one neural ganglion for nervous activity. And each segment is going to have some sort of method of locomotion, some sort of structured aid in the movement process. So the body set plan of these annelids is to repeat these segments over and over. Now, annelids have a closed circulatory system. They have not just a heart, but they're going to have blood, they're going to have vessels through which body fluid and blood is pumped. So in that way, they're similar to the vertebrates. They have a ventral nerve cord. So do vertebrates. The difference is vertebrate ventral nerve cords are protected by the bone structure. So we start to see some more advanced traits. So if we look at the sort of the body structure of a classic annelid, the earthworm, we see the brain region and well-developed nerval ganglia. We see the body segmentation. We see the blood vessels that flow throughout. We see reproductive organs that are going to be found not on every single segment, but are going to be specialized in some areas. So we start to see well-developed organ systems within. Now, in terms of movement, they don't have any bones. As we mentioned before, muscles work best with bones. There's something that the muscle can attach to, something that the muscle can move. But the annelids are still capable of pretty strong movement because of their coelom. The body cavity creates what's referred to as a hydrostatic skeleton. Now, in the mollusks, we saw that the coelom was vastly reduced. There was very little body cavity in the organism. In the annelids, the body cavity extends throughout the organism. It's filled with fluid. This creates a pressure, tight, strong structure that muscles can act against. So the hydrostatic skeleton of the body coelom serves the same purpose in terms of movement as a skeletal structure. You can alternate muscle contractions against this coelom, against this hydrostatic skeleton that allows for complex movement. They also have what are referred to as chitin. These are sort of hairs or bristles of chitin that are found on the external system. So that helps aid in movement because they can move a little bit, but they're also used in sensory structures to help detect movement, the same way we can detect movement with our hairs if they move. So most groups of annelids have these chitin that are found on the outside of the organism. I mentioned they also have a closed circulatory system. They do have to breathe. They do not have lungs. They don't have a respiratory system. Instead, they absorb oxygen directly across the body membrane. So they absorb oxygen through the skin. They release carbon dioxide through their skin. This is why worms will die in the water, because it's not an efficient mechanism enough to absorb oxygen from water. They basically drown if they're put in water. When it rains a lot, which I realize it doesn't do very much here, but when it rains a lot, the water is very moist. You oftentimes see the earthworms coming up out of the soil, because if they stay in the soil, it's too moist, it's too wet, they run the risk of drowning. They have an excretory system, the same kind of nephridia that we saw in mollusks, so ways to release excretory waste. Then each part of the digestive tract is now we start to see specialization. So we start to see a digestive tract where it's not just internal digestion, but there's specialization of what's going on in different parts of the digestive tract. Now the annelids are broken down into two classes. You have the polychaeta, and you have the class Cligellata. Those include the oligocutes, which are the earthworms, and the hirinidae. So the annelids, we have the two different classes. There are about 12,000 different species of annelids. So a lot, but not as many as we see with some other organisms. So we'll start talking about these different individual classes of the annelids when we get back on Wednesday. Do not forget the exam. It is currently online.